Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a fun and dramatic technique that's sure to make your cards stand out. The super popular blackout technique using embossing folders. I'll walk you through how to create this striking look where the embossing really pops against a dark background. Now, full disclosure, this technique was inspired by Nicole Spohr. I saw her do this during Stamptember, and I've been anxious to try it ever since. I'll link her video down below in the video description, along with all of the supplies that I'm using today if you're interested. The embossing folder that I'm going to use today is called Heart Blooms. It is part of the Rainbow Splash collection from Simon Says Stamp, and it is a 2D embossing folder. There's kind of an extra step that Nicole had taken when she did this technique, and I just thought it was going to work a lot better using that 2D embossing folder versus a 3D, but that is on my list to try. Now, I am going for an ombre effect with different shades of pink ink from Simon Says Stamp. That first layer that I applied down towards the bottom third of my card was, I think that one was guava. And then I'm going to come in here in the middle using the peony ink, and then at the top, I'm going to come in with taffy. Now, some of these blended areas might look a little rough. You're going to see some brush lines, but once it dries, it is going to dry back. And plus, once we do the blackout technique, it's totally going to hide all of those imperfections. And the cardstock that I'm using today is a Hammermill cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So once I have that blended, I'm taking the embossing folder. Now, notice how the words printed on the front were facing up towards the camera. I'm taking my cardstock and I'm flipping it over. So the ink part of my panel is down. And there's a reason I'm doing this is I want the impression of the embossing folder to push into the inked part of my panel. You'll see what I mean in just a minute, but I'm essentially kind of doing it backwards. Now, I did flip this when I ran it through my die cut machine doing the embossing sandwich, and you could see how the impression pressed into that inked portion. I don't want the design raised, I want it pushed into the ink. Now for the super fun part of this technique, and that is the blackout technique using the black ink. Now, really any black ink would work here. I am using a VersaFine Nocturne ink, and at first I started using a brayer. So I'm just picking up some of the ink and then rolling that over the background, and you can see that it's going on to the portion that is raised, which is kind of the background and not the design. I did grab a Post-it note to kind of cover my fingers and protect them, but I also just went direct to paper. There were some spots that the brayer just wasn't hitting, so I did go in direct to paper with my ink pad. Now, because VersaFine likes to stay wet for a while, I did dry that with my heat tool really well. And then I'm going to take this and put it over into my Misty stamping tool. I do have a Misty sticky mat down in the bottom, and I have the foam insert removed because I am going to use a background stamp. This is the friendship background stamp, so it's just filled with a bunch of text. And I'm placing that down onto my background, picked it up with the Door of the Misty, and then I'm going to ink it up with the Simon Says Stamp white pigment ink. Now, this is the part that Nicole had done kind of extra with this blackout technique. You could absolutely leave it as is, but she stamped over the top using, I think it was a white pigment ink. I didn't actually pay attention to that part. And it just blew my mind when I saw that. Now, it looks a little much right now, but once everything dries back, it is absolutely amazing. So I know a lot of these pieces were inspired by Nicole. She had used, actually, she did 3 cards in her video, and hers had similar text and backgrounds, but I did try at least change up the colors of it. And I am going to take and add a different sentiment. So I am using some sentiments from the Always and Forever stamp and die set. I am laying them down on some black cardstock that I conditioned with an anti-static powder tool. And then I'm going to ink up the sentiments with a white pigment ink, which is my absolute favorite way to heat emboss with white embossing powder. So I'm just going to sprinkle on that white embossing powder, tap off any of the excess, and then I am going to make sure my heat tool is nice and hot, and then melt that embossing powder with my embossing tool. Now, after that has cooled, I did take like this, I think it's like a stamp eraser. It's from Altenew. I'm hoping I can link it down below. And I just kind of went around the sentiment to help remove any of that excess powder that was on there. I'm going to line up the coordinating die for the word heart and run that through the die cut machine. And now I do need to trim this one out. There's no coordinating die for the smaller sentiment like this. So I'm going to use my mini paper trimmer to trim that out into a thin strip. I'll trim off the edges to just kind of make that nice and neat. And I also trim off a couple extra strips of the black cardstock. Using the rest of that black cardstock, I trimmed out the word heart about, what did I do here? Three more times. And I'm layering them together with some liquid glue. And I'll finish it off by adding the one on top that I heat embossed. I decided that I wanted my sentiment strip to be a little bit skinnier. So I used a bigger piece of cardstock and just have some post-it tape behind it so the sticky part is facing up. And then I can place my sentiment strip on there. And that just makes it a lot easier to trim this down. You could see it's just hairs that I'm cutting off, but it was just enough for me. And I liked this a little bit better. Now I'm using those extra strips of black cardstock that I had trimmed out, and I'm layering that behind my sentiment strip using that same liquid glue. This is just going to add a little bit of stability behind that smaller sentiment. To also just kind of pop it up a little bit more from the background, I did add some thin black foam squares behind it, and then I can place that towards the top of my card. So I did have my sentiments kind of placed out how I wanted it to be to make sure that I was getting them fairly centered and straight. And then adding liquid glue behind the word heart and adding that underneath. I will place something heavy, let that sit for a few minutes. And I created a side folding card base. I'm adding liquid glue behind my entire panel here and then attaching that to the front of the side folding card base. The glass mat that I'm working on is magnetic, and I ran to my fridge and grabbed my magnets because I usually don't use them, but they did come in handy to hold that panel down for a little bit until that glue really adheres. I finished it off by embellishing it with some gold pearls from Gina K Designs. And a fun little note, I showed this to my husband, and what I thought was super cute was immediately he reached out to touch it because he was really intrigued by the design. So if you have not tried that blackout technique yet, I highly recommend it because it is definitely a wow factor to your cards. And then maybe even step it up a notch with that additional stamping. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Here is another video that I think you might enjoy as well. Thanks again.